I want to welcome everyone this morning or afternoon or even evening. I'm Richard Herman. I am a senior faculty fellow at the Mershon Center for National Security Studies. I co-direct with Peter Mansour, a research group that focuses on American foreign and military policy. I've had a career in the past when I was director of the Mershon Center. And so it's an institution very close to my heart. Over the last several years, I've been focused very much on European security, on the politics within NATO and between various NATO states and Russia. And that's what this conference grows out from. When I started putting it together some time ago, I was inviting the people whose writings I knew and some who I knew personally that interested me most and who I would love to learn from and discuss the future of European security with. Over the last several months, lots has happened that has in some ways changed the real world context in which we're meeting and talking, but I convened this and still imagine it to be a conversation among academics who are trying to understand, explain, do scholarship on issues related to the politics of Europe, security in Europe, and European-Russian and American-Russian relations. I've organized the day into 4 panels, but all the participants of the 10 who will speak are welcome to be on the screen at all the day. We're going to start by talking a bit about how we got where we are. I've been looking at this for quite some time, and I'm old enough to have experienced the enthusiasm and the highs of the late 1980s and early 90s and watched ever since. And so I thought maybe the first part of the morning we'd talk about how we went from where we were to where we are. And I know there are very different perspectives on that. I organized a conference in Moscow in 1999, largely with people who had not been supportive of Mikhail Gorbachev, but had opposed him strongly. And I remember them telling me then that I had misnamed the conference. I had titled The End of the Cold War. And they said the Cold War didn't end. The American pressure on Russia has continued since. And it was an eye-opening experience for me 20 some years ago that there was still intense politics about this relationship in Russia, even then, and has pursued, of course, even till now. I thought the second panel would concentrate on the domestic landscapes in the European states and in Russia and in the United States. Then in the afternoon, we'd discuss some of the strategies, the power relationships that has emerged and are changing. And then at the last panel, we'd look at this from a perspective more prescriptive. What is at the root of this conflict? Is it values? Is it interests? And whatever it is, where do we go from here? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers for this morning. We're going to begin with Pascal Venasana. He's a senior fellow and head of research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. He's also professor of political science at the University Panthéon-Assas in Paris. And before that, he held the chair in European security at the European University Institute, Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies in Fiesole. He's written widely, and if you go to the Mershon website, you can see all the things he has written. We're then going to turn to Fudor Lukianov, who is professor of international relations at the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He is editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs and the research director of the Valdai International Discussion Group. In addition, he is chair of the Presidium of the Council for Foreign and Defense Policy and a member of the Russian International Affairs Council. He's also widely published. And again, if you turn to our website, you can see some of the details. And we'll finish, at least this morning's presentations, with Peter Roberts. He's former senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. He served as director of military science at RUSI from January 2014 through November of last year. He's also a non-resident professor of modern warfare at the École de Guerre in Paris. And he is also widely written, a prominent voice across the world on military and security affairs. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor, so to speak, over to Pascal. Pascal, why don't you lead us off?
Thank you so much. Yep. Thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate very much your kind invitation. I think it's great to have this conference, especially now. And I thought in your introduction, you would say that actually you had predicted all this all along since from the very beginning. And I was surprised that you were not actually taking credit for this amazingly good timing. So my presentation today is indeed along the lines that you indicated. How did we get there? But with a focus on two things, with a focus on a French perspective, with a focus on President Emmanuel Macron's, what I will call his grand strategy over the past 5 years. So in other words, I'd like to tell a story about the connection between France, Russia, and European security, and in a sense, tell you the story of what I would call perhaps the rise and fall of Emmanuel Macron's grand strategy. I do so because this war since last February marks, in my view, in many ways, the limits of a grand strategy formulated, pursued in a very consistent manner and often with great determination by the French president since he was elected 5 years ago. Some of you may know that actually the presidential election, the first round, will take place in in 2 days from now. And I think this grand strategy, unfortunately for him at least, has been unable, through this grand strategy, he's been unable to reach one of his key objectives, which was really to create what he called a new architecture of trust and security in Europe. And a key aspect of this new architecture was, of course, Russia. And so what I'd like to do in my presentation is first tell you more about what this grand strategy was. In fact, I would make the case that there was indeed a grand strategy. That's oftentimes one of the key source of contention within the scholarly community among those who use this idea of grand strategy. A number of scholars are saying that's mission impossible. Grand strategy do not exist, right? But in this case, I believe that there was one, and I'd like to tell you more about what it was. The second aspect that I'd like to say a few words about is that this grand strategy was really grounded in a particular perception, or perhaps, of course, misperception of Russia, and particularly of President Vladimir Putin. And I'd like to say more, at least, about the ways in which Emmanuel Macron articulated, presented his perception, again, perhaps misperception of Russia and of President Putin. Lastly, I'll say more about the limits, right? What happened? What were the main challenge faced by the French president that led to this outcome? Now, first, one word about what do we mean by grand strategy, and here I'm building on the work of Nina Silov and also all the contributors to the recently published Oxford Handbook on Grand Strategy. Essentially, there is, I think, a broad agreement that when we talk about grand strategy, we talk about three things: principles, plan, and behavior. Okay, so a grand strategy to me refers certainly to a set of organizing principles. These principles are consciously held, they're used by policymakers to guide their decisions. So in a way, grand strategy has something to do with ideas, one way or the other. A grand strategy has to do with some sort of deliberate long-term plan. This aspect is important, of course, because at the heart of grand strategy, there is this idea that it's designed to harness all elements of national power: political, military, industrial, societal, psychological, diplomatic, to address long-term threats and opportunities. So there has to be some sort of mechanism to bring all these things together, right? A grand strategy is not just about military power. And lastly, grand strategy is not something that is confined to plans or just to ideas. In many ways, in order to exist and to have some sort of substance, it has to refer to some sort of pattern of state behavior, right? we should see outcome, we should see actions, decisions, behavior resulting from that grand strategy. The typical example is, of course, the grand strategy of containment in the US throughout the Cold War. My first point is indeed that when he arrived, when he was elected president 5 years ago, Emmanuel Macron, in the course of a few months, maybe a few years, actually formulated a grand strategy. So what were the key principles that he used to do that? Although he was widely presented at the time as, the banker who, the pro-European banker who put an end to the populist context post-Brexit election of President Trump in the US. In fact, and so that would lead him closer to a sort of broad liberal worldview. In fact, he proved to be quite inspired by an older French tradition in foreign policy, the tradition of the General de Gaulle, the tradition of François Mitterrand as well, and certainly with a desire to break very clearly, very sharply with his immediate predecessors, Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande. He repeatedly, for example, presented France as some sort of balanced power. He meant by that not aligned, rooted in the West, but going beyond these Western characteristics in its foreign policy, and a country that would aspire to independence, that would base its foreign policy on the respect of statehood and heads of states in the international system. So that was how he saw France's role in the world. He also had a very strong European focus, okay? And this was notable in the context of 5 years ago and remains so in a sense today, because the domestic context was at the time quite Eurosceptic. So he explicitly spent political capital on a pro-EU, pro-Europe vision. But of course, not any conception of Europe, and his own conception of Europe was very much focused on things such as strategic autonomy, potentially sovereignty also, that these were themes and words that came back time and again in his presentations. So that were his key principles, the key principles that inform his grand strategy. How about the plan? So the plan, and let me now focus a bit more on Russia, even though Russia was not the only component, obviously, of his grand strategy. But given the overall theme of our discussion, I think a focus on Russia is appropriate. So clearly, as one of the key goals of President Emmanuel Macron's grand strategy, there was this notion, there was what he saw as a necessity to develop with Russia what he called an agenda of trust and security. So at the heart of what Emmanuel Macron tried to do was really a serious engagement with Russia. And why is that? As he repeated time and again, at the heart of his plan is this notion that such an engagement is absolutely crucial, is in the long-term interest of Europe. That is one of his key aspects. So he argued repeatedly that the security and autonomy of Europe can only be guaranteed if Europeans can somehow deal with, integrate, include Russia. So of course there is an element of fuzziness in all this, but it has to recalibrate and reinvent its relationship with Russia. And he has been also very explicit repeatedly about the notion that ignoring Russia or pushing Russia away from Europe would be a profound strategic mistake. So that was, in a nutshell, a key aspect of the plan. Now, how about the behavior, right? Do we have evidence that all this translated somehow in concrete action? And in fact, I believe we do. There is plenty of evidence that throughout this mandate of 5 years, Emmanuel Macron, time and again, was heavily engaged with high-level diplomacy with Vladimir Putin. And I'm just going to, in the interest of time, take just one example. In 2019, the French president did something that no one else had ever done before among French presidents. He invited President Vladimir Putin and his wife at his official retreat of Brégançon. Brégançon Fort is on the French Riviera as well, roughly speaking, a French equivalent of Camp David, if you will, a sort of a holiday residence of French president, to have really sort of an informal, personal engagement, mostly about Ukraine. And that's just one example of a set of high-profile, direct meeting with the Russian president in order to push a variety of agenda for a while, Syria, Ukraine, and more generally, European security. So my bottom line is, as you can see, my argument would say that the French president had a grand strategy, and in this grand strategy, Russia was a priority. Now, this grand strategy, of course, was grounded, right, was based on his own view, a sort of a particular perception of Russia, and particularly a particular perception of President Putin. Now, I'm saying perception, I'm well aware that it could very well be a misperception as well. And among these participants today, we are fortunate to have excellent specialists of Russia, so they can share whether they thought that Emmanuel Macron was completely off, or whether he had a number of points. And I should also make explicit that when I'm referring to this perception of the French president, I specifically refer to the beginning of his mandate, so 2017, 2019, simply because that's the moment in which all these elements came across in a very public and in a very systematic and straightforward way. Now, I would assume that, of course, this perception may have changed, particularly recently, but at least that was clearly his view at the beginning of his mandate. So the way he analyzed the motivation and the actions of the president of the Federation of Russia was really with a focus on three aspects. He understood President Putin as with a strong objective to restore a powerful Russian imaginary to keep his country together. He also recognized that the fight against terrorism was highly prominent, and he understood that as being significant. There was a set of insurgencies, forms of violence, religious identities on the borders of Russia and beyond. And lastly, according to Emmanuel Macron, again, that's his view, nothing else than that, he made the case that the Russian president wanted, of course, at all costs to avoid Russia becoming some sort of failed state. Now, so that was the way he portrayed Vladimir Putin. Now, he also argued that, in his view, all of this, and generally speaking, the political agenda of Vladimir Putin was likely to be unsustainable. And in fact, he said that publicly, rightly or wrongly, but he said that publicly. He also perceived Russia as comparatively weak, an aging country, a small, relatively small GDP, increasing domestic political tension, perhaps also legitimacy crisis, looming legitimacy crisis. And therefore, in that context, according to the French president, the president of Russia had essentially three options, right? One option, in his view, was to try to rebuild Russia's power alone, but he immediately explained, especially in an interview with The Economist and other speeches, that this would be almost a mission impossible due to some sort of identity conservatism, a rejection of Muslim migration that could perhaps help revive the economy. So that in his view, was unlikely. The second option would be the famous Eurasia model, but according to Emmanuel Macron, such an option would lead almost automatically Russia to become some sort of satellite of China down the line. So this option, in his view, is not very attractive. And that's where, in his view, the Europeans should come in. He thought that the third option would be to rebuild a balanced position with Europe. And in his view, the duty of everybody, according to Emmanuel Macron, was to really provide such an option to the Russian leadership. And that was the way out of that situation, in his view. Once again, that at least that's how we can reconstitute his own perception of what Russia wanted at that time. The outcome of all this, and that would be my conclusion, almost my conclusion, was that in the end, Emmanuel Macron did not obtain any significant results. There was overall almost no progress or improvement in the bilateral relation between France and Russia. No visible, no obvious gain on Syria, in which the situation remained catastrophic. Ultimately, no particular gain on Ukraine, which was, as I say, a key topic for a number of meeting, high-profile meeting, and follow-up with the French president. If anything, the relationship actually generated additional problems between France and Russia, about Libya, about sub-Saharan Africa, notably in Mali, where the private military company Wagner is involved. And lastly, it became also to some degree counterproductive with Europeans and perhaps also with the US, particularly the Democrats. It created a situation in which, to some extent, Emmanuel Macron was suspected of complacency vis-à-vis Russia, which created a number of problems. 2 words to conclude. Why those limits? What led to this outcome? I'll close with just these two arguments. The first is that in order for such a grand strategy, and it was an ambitious grand strategy, in order for this to work, you need buyers, right? You need other countries to come aboard, to connect. The French president needed other countries to connect and to buy and to agree to play along these lines, and this did not happen. So the first characteristics was overall the indifference of Vladimir Putin, relatively skeptical, tends to be skeptical about Europeans in general, did not take Emmanuel Macron sufficiently seriously, could have been interested in an initiative if Macron had been able to convince other European countries to come along. But since that was not the case, there was very little interest in a purely French initiative. The only thing, it may be the case that the Russian president saw actually an opportunity to divide Europeans and perhaps the transatlantic connection. Which leads me, of course, to the second factor, which is the neglect of European allies. Macron would have been unable to implement such a grand strategy alone, yet many of the ideas, many of the plans behind this grand strategy vis-à-vis Russia were, and in my view remain, in contradiction with the European mainstream. The French president and his grand strategy did not understand, let alone share, the same view of Europe with their European partners, certainly not in Central and Eastern Europe, certainly not among Scandinavian countries, and there were also a number of doubts both in the UK and in Germany. So ultimately, at least on that aspect of the French grand strategy, there is a degree of isolation ultimately for the French president. In fact, at some point, it has not been the case in more recent months, but at some point it generated even perhaps the worst possible combination of the French president providing some sort of unilateral openings to Russia on the one hand, and on the other hand, made deliberately highly provocative public criticism of NATO being brain dead, for example, as well as playing up a public antagonism with Erdogan, Turkey. So the combination of these things, of course, does not play very well for most European countries, and certainly in Central and Eastern Europe. So that is my bottom line. Overall, there was a French grand strategy about European security and about Russia. It only achieved very limited result. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that it's a sort of I'm tilting at a straw man. I do want to recognize, and this will be my last point, that assessing grand strategy is obviously challenging, and I want to recognize that one could make the case that perhaps dealing with the Russia of Vladimir Putin was an especially tough objective, and therefore the prospect of any grand strategy succeeding was perhaps exceedingly small. Thank you so much. I look forward to your comments, questions, and reactions. And thanks, much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Pascal. That was terrific. I want to just mention that I failed to do this at the top of the conference, how much I appreciate all of you being here. For Pascal, this is of course getting to be late in the evening. For Fudor, who's about to speak, it's earlier evening. And for some, I noticed Andrei Sagankov is on now. It's very early, I suspect, in the morning. So if we were all in Columbus, some of you would be suffering jet lag, and we'd be together. We avoid the jet lag partly, but I so much appreciate all of you coming on here. We're going to turn now to Fyodor. I'll turn the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for this invitation and for this conference you organized. Indeed, timing is absolutely unbelievable. And when I received this invitation, I think 2.5 or 3 months ago, I started to think very slowly what I can say, and this issue is indeed interesting, but we are so much tired of discussing all this stuff, what went wrong, what could go differently, and so on. But now we see that it's almost the only thing which we need to discuss now, and probably we will need to do it in the future many, many times, because what is happening now in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Russia, it's on the one hand, it's absolutely unbelievably terrible tragedy, which I think none of us expected. And I was among those who denied the looming reality until the last moment. So since that, I feel professionally totally bankrupt, because I really didn't believe that we would go that far. At the same time, in order to understand why things went that catastrophically now, I think we need to go pretty much back in history of European security architecture, European security arrangements, and in particular the thinking which was behind different moves and actions on Russian, firstly on the Soviet side and then on the Russian side. That's why I think in my short introduction, I will focus on events which are pretty far away from us. And but I'm absolutely sure that in order to understand the current situation, we need to start almost from the very beginning. And this very beginning is approximately 35 years ago now. And this is the beginning, the launch of the so-called perestroika in the Soviet Union. And before I go to my argument, I would like to bridge to make a link to the excellent presentation of Pascal, because he described to us the grand strategy which President Macron tried to outline and implement vis-a-vis Russia and Vladimir Putin. I think this notion of grand strategy is pretty essential for what I will discuss, and what we are discussing about the current situation. The problem on the Russian side, from my point of view, and of course we have here excellent specialists like Professor Tsigankov or Professor Laruelle, they know this much better than me. But I think the problem which we can identify on the Russian side from the beginning of this period until now, actually, until this very particular moment, this is actually a lack of any grand strategy. or to put it more precise, the grand strategy did exist at the beginning, at the very beginning, when Gorbachev launched his new thinking. But that grand strategy turned to be totally utopian and wrong. While everything which happened after that, after collapse of the Soviet Union, after the whole narrative and framework of perestroika and new political thinking and glasnost disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union. After that, Russian Federation, be it under Boris Yeltsin or later on under Vladimir Putin in all his incarnations, because we can easily see many parts, many elements, many slots in his very long presidency. So it was never any kind of grand strategy behind Russian actions, despite the fact that many Western commentators, especially in media, they try to invent something. They try to subscribe to Putin, especially when relationships started to deteriorate, subscribe to Putin several ideas which he eventually wanted to turn into grand strategy worldwide. But I would rather insist on my perception as a person who follows Russian foreign policy since approximately 25 years, that was actually a very big problem, that any grand strategy was lacking. And those strategies which were tried to be presented as frameworks, they were pretty short-lived, and they were replaced by something else, basically not because of some, or not in all cases because of some conceptual changes, but frequently because of very concrete situations and changes of conjuncture. But as I said, from my point of view, and I started to think about it just late last year, when Russian diplomacy put this big big package of demands on the table, and Russian foreign ministry started to officially publicly mention that we want to be back to the security situation in Europe as it was before 1997. And that was a very remarkable, I would say, political time machine, which was switched on. Not very usual statement and narrative, but that brought me to this feeling and to this idea that much of what is happening is probably a product of realization on the side of Russian leadership that things as they evolved after collapse of the Soviet Union, they went wrong. They did not produce any result, be it on a security field or even broader in terms of principles and framework of Russian general development. So maybe consciously or unconsciously, Mr. President decided to, so to say, to revise the path which was behind us, and to try to go back to the crossroad, which of course was not in the year 1997, but in fact it was 10 years earlier than 1997, in the second half of 1980s. So this February, it coincided with the beginning of Russian military operation in Ukraine. It was an anniversary of Mikhail Gorbachev's famous speech on the 27th Party Congress in Moscow, in February, I think February 24th and 25th, 1986. And that was actually the last normal party congress of Communist Party of the Soviet Union, with all accessoires which we knew from the past. But in the report, in a big speech delivered by Gorbachev, for the first time he mentioned this term new political thinking, or new thinking as it was put later on, and formulated some principles. The main one was that Russian Federation was ready to replace class values with the all human values, the international values, so to say. At that time, we didn't know in the Soviet Union yet the notion of liberal values, but actually what he mentioned was the prototype of them. And that was the profound turn. He also mentioned the necessity to abstain from military means in international relationship and so on. And that was actually the beginning of this new political thinking, which then, I think in 1987, was published first in Russia and then in America in his famous book, New Thinking for Our Country and the Whole World. And that was the framework, the ideological framework for perestroika, both inside but mainly outside the country. And Gorbachev actually Gorbachev actually was the first big international leader, and as all of us remember, at that time Soviet Union was one of two pillars of international order. So he formulated the framework for liberal globalization. Again, he didn't use this word and didn't know it yet, but still. And of course, all of us know reasons why Soviet leadership had to change the whole pattern, the whole ideological pattern, and start to move towards this openness and new thinking. Economic problems and the increasing burden of increasing geopolitical burden was getting step by step unbearable, and the Soviet Union wanted to get rid of at least partially of this. But the way how Gorbachev wanted to do it was actually to launch a grand design, a grand strategy, which would allow to change the whole international framework, international politics, and make Russia, or sorry, Soviet Union at that time, the co-founder of this new international system. And a little bit later, Gorbachev's entourage, Gorbachev's advisors, and those who worked in his team, they formulated this idea of common European home, which, from their point of view, was not about to just was about to get rid of confrontation in Europe and broader in the whole world, but not to leave it as it was after that, but to start to create a completely new international European system and then international system, where something like a big condominium, where Russia, Soviet Union, United States would be the co-founders, the equal co-founders of this, and then rearrange the whole Europe, Eurasia, and then international environment towards convergency, towards ideas of convergency, which he or his friends, his team actually borrowed from academician Andrei Sakharov and earlier from the well-known Russo-American sociologist Peterim Sorokin. And that was actually the idea, the big framework, the big strategy, which Gorbachev and his team offered, and they expected the new world to emerge alongside with emergence of a new Soviet Union. So they saw this new international system as a means of transformation of the Soviet Union and vice versa. So we know the result. It didn't happen. But what I think is very much essential and is very important for us as scholars, as those who probably in years and decades to come will try to understand why this extremely exciting experiment with liberal world order and liberal Russia failed. Those who remember the late years of the Soviet Union, they know for sure that Gorbachev's openness and glasnost launched an extremely rich and interesting intellectual debate in the Soviet Union. Debate which was not in place before because of censorship, because of ideological pressure, but a removal of those barriers and limitations generated an explosion of intellectual energy, which was extremely interesting. I remember not everything because at that time I was a student and studied German philology, so it was not exactly my field, but I remember how excited all of us are aware, my parents, my friends, my colleagues, to see all this richness of intellectual debate opening. And this debate was not linear. We had a lot of different ideas in different schools of thought, actually, about how our country, Soviet Union, should develop in the future, at which direction, with which, based on which conceptual framework. And since Soviet rule was equally oppressive to all, be it liberals or nationalists or whoever, all those ideas and all this intellectual heritage, the intellectual legacy, which was suppressed before, came up. And this, I think that this debate was absolutely crucial for the future development, because Soviet Russian intellectuals, Russian society had to come to some kind of conclusions about the past and based on that about the future. And this debate has never been completed because collapse of the Soviet Union basically cut all discussions and all reflections. After collapse of the Soviet Union, two things happened. One, the most cruel one was that it was no time for reflection anymore, no time, no possibility for intellectual work, because most of society and the whole state were put on the course of survival. It was both about individuals and about the state per se. And for several years, maybe a decade or longer, the whole energy was dedicated primarily to this, how to survive. And that was not the best period for intellectual work. Second reason, and to some extent it was probably even worse, all discussions were cut because the feeling emerged that it was no need anymore to reflect on the future, past and future of the country, because this framework, conceptual framework of end of history, of victory of liberal ideas worldwide, basically undermined and eliminated for many, or at least created the feeling of elimination, of necessity to think about peculiarities and particularities of Russia. So since end of history won in the whole across the globe, why should we think that we are different? So this eternal discussion between Russian Westernizers, Slavophiles, nationalists, liberals, communists, that was, so to say, again, it was such a perception that now we know the answer, or if not the answer, but the only way which was available. And from my point of view, looking from 2022, facing these terrible events we see now, I think that was the absolutely crucial moment. And the fact that this discussion, this reflection has never been completed, led us to the 30 years of further development until now, when no grand strategies, no big ideas were in place, and Russia just tried to operate with very tactical means without any theoretical framework. And if you try, sometimes, both under Yeltsin period and under Putin period, and now again, we have a lot of talks about necessity to have an ideology, new ideology. But at the same time, this ideology is perceived as something which should instrumentally mend our development and give us, so to say, some support for further muddling through. But in fact, since theories were abandoned, initially because of end of history, and then because of lack of understanding that we had need of them. So at the end of the day, we end up with this mixture as today, mixture of hurt feelings about the past, the perception that those 30 years went wrong, elements of nationalism, but very strange one. It's not the nationalism many people feared in 1990s or at the beginning of 2000s. It's something else. It's an attempt to recover after recovery, so to say, the transition after transit after transition. So very, very strange feeling from my point of view. And by the way, the fact that despite the big thing which is happening now, we still don't understand clearly what is the end game, what is the purpose of this military operation, that's part of the same. So what I conclude with this, what I wanted to convey is that, from my point of view, in order to understand what went wrong, we need to go back to the last period of the Soviet Union. Again, the discussion which was started there by Russian intellectuals was extremely important. Unfortunately, it never led to any conclusion. I don't know whether we will be able to relaunch this discussion now in this completely new situation and new environment, but in fact, it is very much necessary to do. And I hope that Russian intellectuals and with help of Western intellectuals who study Russia will be able to fulfill the job which we didn't do 30 plus years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great. I'm glad to see that Mary Sarati has joined us, because if the 1990s, and I don't disagree, were absolutely critical, her study of this, I think, is the best I've read, and we can come back to that in the conversations shortly. Thank you very much. Peter Roberts, why don't you complete the lead off of the morning panel?
Well, thanks very much. And I'm most grateful to you, Richard, and to Pete for this opportunity. It's a great and timely topic, as everyone said, and an overwhelming pleasure to be alongside such an august and distinguished set of speakers. I agree with a huge amount of what Pascal and Fyodor have said. I enjoyed their differences in definition about what constitutes grand strategies and indeed ideologies. But it'd be something dull as an audience, right, if you only got one side of the story. So let me postulate something different that might elicit some discussion. We've ended up today on Ukraine, on NATO, on Russia, and on the Russian military performance in Ukraine. Where all that has come from, where we've ended up, is entirely predictable. Let me explain why through the prism of military theory and defense politics and policy post-Cold War. It's a story about failures of imagination, a tale of two bodies of knowledge that slip past each other like ships in fog, completely missing the signs, the moments, and the signals of imminent collision. Most of all, this is a story about the attention economy. And by this, I mean what timescales the relative political audiences work to. Let me try and explain that. Since the late 70s and early 1980s, there's been a widely held but unspoken orthodoxy that another major European war could ever happen. Certainly not in the scale or duration of the two major world wars of the 20th century. As the generation that fought those wars started to take a backseat in politics and national security discussions and foreign policy narratives, the drive towards a liberalized world focused on domestic rather than international issues became deeply entrenched in the minds of European leaders. Over time, and particularly after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, European leaders increasingly bought into the idea of the end of history, as Fyodor mentioned. Fukuyama's thesis on humanity's political progression through modern history became the lingua franca of the mantra of Europe's new leaders. Focus was swiftly shifting to the US plan to beat the USSR through economic means rather than military ones. Some European states adapted this view and adopted this view rapidly, Thatcher's United Kingdom among them, shifting defense spending for the 1970s into social spending and domestic political agenda. Europe in the early 1990s saw this trend increase in pace, marginalizing their own defense capability. This is the much remarked upon peace dividend, shifting spending in favor of domestic programs, balanced budgets, and savings. Despite claims of complacency that might have been leveled as a result of the violence in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo, et al., the key players in Europe continued the military cuts and shifted from an interventionist series of strategies that saw them distance themselves from the national security assumptions that had underpinned that fragile piece of the Cold War. The consensus in the 90s and 2000s was that Russia was the sick man of Eurasia. It wasn't simply a declining superpower to be taken seriously. There was a widely held belief across European capitals that Russia wasn't simply that declining power, but her economy was in such turmoil that terminal decline was a foregone conclusion within a decade. The threat spectrum to Europeans became mainstreamed into terrorism and humanitarian interventions. Military forces became redirected to these tasks, and the scale and warfighting capability was considered largely unnecessary. When the US signaled a shift away from the ability to conduct two regional wars simultaneously, European states saw this as the perfect opportunity for further cuts in defense spending and on their militaries. The NATO spending of 2% became so ambiguous that whilst almost any expense could be included within it, it allowed states to appear almost compliant while letting their militaries waste away. In Libya, NATO and France, Italy, and the UK in particular suffered a major shock. Their inability to conduct high-intensity military operations without US support against a considerably inferior adversary was a shameful performance. Worse still was the grandstanding of politicians who never failed to understand, or rather, who did fail to understand completely, the basics of grand strategy and sustainable end states. Not even the strategic shocks of military engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan and the failures of a highly professional, well-equipped and motivated Western force could reverse the ambivalence of Europe's political class to military thinking and spending. In terms of military matters, the divergence of Western and Russian theories has been remarkable. Given the West's focus on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, the professionalization of its forces has progressed considerably. Even new NATO members have adopted these standardization protocols with some alacrity and enthusiasm. But these Western forces have also sacrificed warfighting scale for constabulary roles. This is not simply materially, but also ethically, morally, and critically, intellectually. Given the success of the Reagan administration's aggressive approach to the USSR in the High North and the 1982 air-land battle doctrine, as much responsible for Soviet collapse as the high spending on R&D programs, it's hardly surprising that Western military orthodoxy enjoyed its unswerving pursuit of decapitation strategies, reinforced by fast success in Kuwait and Iraq. Fast, easy wars were the predicted futures, the military buying into the political mantras of responsibility to protect hearts and minds and long-range policing actions. The reality of this in terms of capital equipment has left most Western armies and military with huge recapitalization programs that have been placed at risk by deferment and making realistic modernization of heavy warfighting capabilities simply unaffordable, but also undeliverable. NATO armies are a shadow of their former selves, despite their ability on paper to mass a considerable weight of capability between them. In intellectual terms, the situation is even more grave. Slimmed down academic and staff training now places an emphasis and rewards on financial skills rather than intellectual ones. The lack of depth in professional military education and the learn by rote approach to teaching, almost solely focused on Clausewitz, has narrowed the gaze of leaders and caused a fixation on fewer and fewer theories of military campaigning. But perhaps, excuse me, the most worrying element of Western military decline is in the change of attitudes of the fighting human, especially in comparison to adversaries. It is natural that militaries strive to reflect the societies which they come from, but slightly more important is the fact that they retain the courage, grit, determination, stamina, and mental fortitude to defeat the hardest possible opponent. There are signs here that the West is falling behind, ironically, because it has moved so far in terms of morals and ethics in the last 30 years. When talking to military officers across Europe, they find it hard to believe we used to talk about tactical nuclear weapons so easily and freely, and moreover, to consider their use as a natural extension of conventional arms. Contrast this with non-Western states, those who have not shifted their compasses in the same direction as those from the West. Whilst their capabilities may not have advanced and digitized in the same way as many in the West, they have certainly been watching and learning from Western campaigns. Yet they have not had such a shift in morals, and how they fight reflects this. Yet both sides, the East and West, have been fascinated by the idea of a revolution in military affairs for some decades. If Russian investment has favored an electronic warfare and missile approach, the West has been betting heavily on digital technology and militarized commercial products since the aforementioned air-land battle doctrine and the arrival of precision-guided munitions. There's a considerable amount of literature on both sides of the wall about the RMA, or the military technical revolution for the Russians, yet neither of their beliefs seem to have held water. The promised nirvana in the West of wet network-centric warfare never arrived, but neither did MTR for the Russians. All that Field Marshal Gereev predicted would come to pass simply hasn't been delivered. As some have pointed out, the Russian military has been weaving between a Delphic or Cassandrian approach to MTP, resulting in few gains ever being made. But so what on the basis of all that? Russian forces have had some considerable success with their revised fighting doctrine, how they fight, if you will, in Georgia, in Crimea, in Donbass, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Syria, in the Arctic, the Balkans, and elsewhere on the globe. Yet in Ukraine over the past 6 weeks, there's been a considerable failure in the functioning of their military. These related exactly to those experiences and tensions that have been occurring across the Russian military for the past 20 years. For me, there are three considerable issues here that all sit above the minor tactical analysis and lessons that have come out. Firstly, they forgot and underinvested in the basics of logistics as the key enabler of warfare. Now, this is a historical normal for the Russian military approach. Secondly, they failed to deliver the mass firepower in the initial assault. So you compare the 200 cruise missiles used by the Russians in the first 3 days in Ukraine, contrasted with the 2,000 cruise missiles in the first hour of the US 2003 shock and awe campaign. And finally, the third reason is this was a rubbish plan for Ukraine. It was based on the Kool-Aid of belief in something called a revolution of military affairs and a decapitation strategy that simply was never going to deliver. The Russian campaign for Ukraine in 2022 was in fact one that was entirely Western and should be familiar to any Western military officer. Observations about what has happened in Ukraine, about the performance of each belligerent, the leadership, red lines, brinkmanship, insurgencies, rationality, logistics, economics, iron and steel versus cyber and space, they're all running rampant. And they're valid questions about why the Russian forces and their political leadership developed the plan they did. One that wasn't just poor, it was terrible and executed disastrously. But the most important question to be addressed, and I think Fyodor and Pascal both hinted at this, was how will this end? And alongside sits that the corollary question, how do we know it will end like that? For these conundrums, there seems to be a gap in the discussion by experts. And this reflects the realities of warfare. No one knows which way the fickle hand of fate will turn. But that doesn't mean that tackling these questions can simply be deferred until later. There are important considerations that have much longer term implications than simply discussing Ukraine and Russia. Now, it might be, and it seems unlikely at this stage, that Russia eventually achieves its aims, whatever those are. It could set Moscow on a new course economically and militarily and allow it or encourage it to go elsewhere in a similar way. If Russia is beaten, however, it will place the regime in Moscow, according to Macron's point, as Pascal pointed out, it will place the regime in Moscow in a difficult position with the associated danger whereby the use of force might become not just attractive again, but necessary for regime survival. And this goes back to the years before Gorbachev, sitting deep within the psyche of Russian leaders. Europe has been here before. I mean, there are echoes of Germany between the wars being aired privately in some quarters. In defeat, economic disaster would become a real spectre, leaving Putin in a precarious position that require even more radical decisions to justify his actions. In countering the West, the West might need to either rapidly ease sanctions, which wouldn't be good when you're trying to send messages to Beijing at the same time, in order to avoid that default in Russian sovereign debt, or to consider an economic aid package on a scale not seen since the Marshall Plan. Failure to support the Russian economy, even to provide it with a modicum of growth, would not just make Russia the sick man of Eurasia, but would put Moscow back into a position where extreme options might become radical, I apologize for that, might become rational decisions. Avoiding that must become a priority in any eventual peace deal. Such an agreement must provide the key element that Putin has promised his people, that Russia would be recognized as a great power, as well as being his own off-ramp. That in turn requires an eventual peace accord that must be between the US and Russia, and that Russia will need re-acceptance back into the international community as quickly as possible after hostilities cease. The balance, therefore, between appeasement and future conflict prevention will be exceedingly difficult, particularly given the fact that in some ways NATO has badly failed in the last 30 years. And why do I say this? Well, if you look at NATO's primary mission in terms of deterrence, it has clearly failed where previously it had been remarkably successful. One must wonder why this had been, and actually if it was performing actions that were deterrence and not indeed containment since the 1990s, as they were argued towards Russia. And if you regard NATO's strategy towards Russia as containment since the 1990s, well, you could argue this either way as a success or failure. Yet we cannot escape the point that signaling and messaging from the West as a whole, and specifically from NATO, has been increasingly poor since the late 2000s. That's not to say, and I agree entirely here with Pascal, that there wasn't a grand strategy across some European capitals. Indeed, NATO had a grand strategy. It was awful, but it had one. And just as the strategy was built on, let's be kind, dubious assumptions, it was also a false understanding of Russia and indeed the way the world actually operated, as opposed to the way that you wished it operated. What's more, NATO has developed and still maintains a very myopic view of Russia. How can this conflict and the wider relationship, the long-term relationship with Russia, end in a way that doesn't involve either continued conflict or national collapse? Now, ending wars is rarely anything other than a Gordian knot. Through history, few leaders have been able to deliver a lasting peace. Treaties are often written by those still immersed in the passion and emotion of the conflict, leading to painful economic circumstances and short periods of peace, but as the harbingers of greater long-term, even more violent conflict. The desire for revenge, reparations, and the demonization of enemies often cloud the judgments of leaders, especially after a short war, perhaps exasperated in a world that has forgotten the harsh realities of combat, despite recent violence in Syria, Israel, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Sudan, Mali, and Georgia. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is unlikely to have an easy solution. One hopes that today's decision makers are up to the task of finding a recipe for peace that views the long term as a priority over short-term ceasefires. That in itself does not bode well for the people of Ukraine. My final point returns to the development of Russian military theory. Do not expect Russia to simply end military progression. More likely, the Russian military will correct itself in spending and focus on training, logistics, combined arms operations, and a shift away from the revolution in military affairs and decapitation strategies made popular by Basil Littlehart's Plan 1919 theories. I would guard against any predetermined view of the future that places Russia at the bottom of the pile in terms of military capability. Their thinking stems from the Franz Academy. The Franz is one of the most intellectually curious and experimental professional military education establishments in the world. There are a myriad of military strategies on the shelf developed there, and I'm a huge admirer, as one should be, of your potential adversaries. We can only hope they continue to pick poor plans in their future. Back to you, Richard.